Hey, it's Brett, and you're watching Brett and Some Books. Today, we are continuing Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 72 by Hunter S. Thompson. This chapter is called Later in March. The Banshee screams in Florida. The emergence of Mankiewicz. Hard times for the man from Maine. Redneck power and hell on wheels for George Wallace. Hube slithers out of obscurity. Fear and loathing on the Democratic left. On Monday morning, the day before the Florida primary, I flew down to Miami with Frank Mankiewicz, who runs the McGovern campaign. We hit the runway at just over 200 miles an hour in a strong crosswind, bouncing first on the left wheel and then about 100 yards down the runway on the right wheel. Then another long bounce, and finally straightening out just in front of the main terminal at Miami's International Airport. Nothing serious, but my Bloody Mary was spilled all over Monday's Washington Post on the armrest. I tried to ignore it and looked over at Mankiewicz sitting next to me, but he was still snoring peacefully. I poked him. "Here we are," I said. "Down home in Fat City again. What's the schedule?" Now he was wide awake, checking his watch. "I think I have to make a speech somewhere," he said. "I also have to meet Shirley MacLaine somewhere. Where's the phone? I have to make some calls." Soon we were shuffling down the corridor toward the big baggage claim merry-go-round. Mankiewicz had nothing to claim. He had learned to travel light. His baggage, as it were, consisted of one small canvas bag that looked like an oversized shaving kit. My own bundle, 2 massive leather bags, and a Xerox telecopier strapped into a fiberglass Samsonite suitcase would be coming down the baggage claim chute at any moment. I intend to travel heavy, not for any good reason, but mainly because I haven't learned the tricks of the trade. "I have a car waiting," I said. "A fine bronze gold convertible. Do you need a ride?" "Maybe," he said, "but I have to make some calls first." Little Leon, stop. "You go ahead and get your car and all that goddamn baggage, and I'll meet you down by the main door." I nodded and hurried off. The Avis counter was only about 50 yards away from the wall phone where Mankiewicz was setting up shop with a handful of dimes and a small notebook. He made at least 6 calls and a page of notes before my bags arrived, and by the time I began arguing with the car rental woman, the expression on Mankiewicz's face indicated he had everything under control. I was impressed by this show of efficiency. Here was the one-man organizing vortex, main theorist, and central intelligence behind the McGovern for President campaign. A small, rumpled little man who looked like something like an out-of-work, pre-owned car salesman, putting McGovern's primary action together from a public wall phone in a Miami airport. Mankiewicz, a 47-year-old Los Angeles lawyer who was director of the Peace Corps before he became Bobby Kennedy's press secretary in '68, has held various job titles since the McGovern campaign got underway last year. For a while he was press secretary, then he was called the campaign manager. Now he appears to be comfortable with the title of political director, which hardly matters because he has become McGovern's alter ego. There are people filling all the conventional job slots, but they are essentially frontmen. Frank Mankiewicz is to McGovern what John Mitchell is to Nixon, the man behind the man. 2 weeks before voting day in New Hampshire, Mankiewicz was on his phone telling his friends he expected McGovern to get past 38% of the vote. This was long before Ed Muskie's infamous breakdown scene in that flatbed truck in front of the Manchester Union leader. When Frank laid this prediction on his friends in the Washington journalism establishment, they figured he was merely doing his job, trying to calm the press and hopefully drum up last-minute surge for McGovern, the only candidate in the '72 presidential race who had any real claim on the residual loyalties of the so-called Kennedy machine. Beyond that, Mankiewicz was a political columnist for the Washington Post before he quit to run McGovern's campaign, and his former colleagues were not inclined to embarrass him by publicizing nonsense. Journalists, like the rich, are inclined to protect their own, even those who go off on hopeless tangents. So Frank Mankiewicz ascended the instant guru level on the morning of March 8th when the final New Hampshire tally showed McGovern with 37.5% of the Democratic primary vote, and frontrunner Ed Muskie with only 46%. New Hampshire in 72 jolted Muskie just as brutally as New Hampshire in 68 jolted LBJ. He cursed the press and hurried down to Florida, still talking like the champ, and reminding everybody within reach that he had, after all, won in New Hampshire. Just like LBJ, who beat McCarthy by 20 points and then quit before the primary 4 weeks later in Wisconsin. But Muskie had only 1 week before the deal would go down in Florida, and he was already locked in. He came down and hit the streets with what his handlers called a last-minute blitz, shaking many hands and flooding the state with buttons, flyers, and handbills saying, "Trust Muskie and believe Muskie, and Muskie talks straight." When Big Ed arrived in Florida for the blitz, he looked and acted like a man who had been cracked. Watching him in action, I remembered the nervous scene of impending doom in the face of Floyd Patterson when he weighed in for his championship rematch with Sonny Liston in Vegas. Patterson was so obviously crippled in his head that I couldn't raise a bet on him, at any odds, among the 100 or so veteran sports writers in the ringside seats on fight night. I was sitting next to Rocky Marciano in the first row, and just before the fight began, I bought 2 tall paper cups full of beer because I didn't want to have to fuck around with drink vendors after the fighting got underway. 2? Marciano asked with a grin. I shrugged and drank one off very quickly as Floyd came out of his corner, and I turned to wax the first time Liston hit him. Then, with the minutes still to go in the first round, Liston bashed him again and Patterson went down for the count. The fight was over before I touched my second beer. Muskie went the same way to Florida, just as Mankiewicz had predicted 48 hours earlier in the living room of his suburban Washington home. "Muskie is already finished," he said to them. "He has no base. Nobody's really for Muskie. They're only for the front runner, the man who says he's the only one who can beat Nixon. But not even Muskie himself believes that anymore. He couldn't even win a majority of the Democratic vote in New Hampshire on his own turf." The next morning on the plane from Washington to Miami, I tried for a firmer insight into Mankiewicz's wisdom by offering to bet $100 that Muskie would finish worse than second. I saw him running third, not much ahead of Jackson, with the Hube not far behind Wallace, and Lindsay beating McGovern with something like 11% to 9%. This was before I watched both McGovern's and Lindsay's final lame shots on Monday night. McGovern at the University of Miami and Lindsay at the Charles Evers at a black church in North Miami. By late Monday, 7 hours before the polls opened, I thought both of them might finish behind Shirley Chisholm, which almost happened. Lindsay finished with something around 7%, McGovern with roughly 6%, Chisholm with 4%, while George Wallace rolled home with 42%, followed in the distance by Humphrey with 18.5%, Jackson with 12.5%, and Muskie with 9%. Remember when you go out to vote tomorrow that the eyes of America are upon you, all the livelong day. The eyes of America are upon you, and they will not go away. Senator George McGovern at a rally in the University of Miami the night before the Florida primary. Kazart! This fantastic rain outside, a sudden cloudburst drenching everything. The sound of rain smacking down on my concrete patio about 10 feet away from the typewriter, beating down on the surface of the big aqua-lighted pool out there across the lawn. Rain blowing into the porch and whipping the palm fronds around in the warm night air. Behind me, on the bed, my waterproof Sonny says it's 5:28 right now in Miami. Then Rod Stewart's hoarse screech. "Mother, don't you recognize your son?" Before this rain, I can hear the sea rolling in the beach. This atmosphere is getting very high, full of strange memory flashes. "Mother, don't you recognize me now?" Wind, rain, surf, palm trees leaning in the wind, Hard funk, blues on the radio, a flagon of wild turkey on the sideboard. Are those footsteps outside? High heels running in the rain? Keep on typing, but my mind is not really on it. I keep expecting to hear the screen door bang open and turn around to see a S Thompson standing behind me, soaked to the skin, smiling, leaning over my shoulder to see what I'm cranking out tonight, and then laughing, softly, leaning closer, wet nipples against my neck, perfume around my head. And now on the radio. Wild horses, we'll ride them someday. Perfect. Get it on. Don't turn around. Keep this fantasy rolling and don't try to notice anything. The sky is getting light outside. Dawn is coming up and I have to fly to Mazatlan in 5 hours to deal with the drug fugitive. Life is getting very complicated. After Mazatlan, I have to run back to San Francisco and get this gibberish ready for the printer. And then on to Wisconsin to chronicle the next act in the saga of downers and treachery called the Campaign Trail. Wisconsin is the site of the next Democratic primary. 6 serious candidates in this one, racing around the state in chartered jets, spending 10 grand a day for the privilege of laying in a series of terrible bummers on the natives. Dull speeches for breakfast, dollar speeches for lunch, and then bullshit with gravy for dinner. How long, O Lord? How long? Where will it end? The only possible good that can come of this wretched campaign is the ever-increasing likelihood that it will cause the Democratic Party to self-destruct. A lot of people are seriously worried about this, but I am not one of them. I've never been much of a party man myself, and the more I learn about the realities of national politics, the more I'm convinced that the Democratic Party is an atavistic endeavor, more an obstacle than a vehicle, and that there is really no hope for accomplishing anything genuinely new or different in American politics until the Democratic Party is done away with. It is a bogus alternative to the hit politics of Nixon. A gang of senile leeches like George Meany, Hubert Humphrey, and Mayor Daley, Scoop Jackson, Ed Muskie, Frank Rizzo, the super cop mayor of Philadelphia. George McGovern is also a Democrat, and I suppose I have to sympathize with some guilt-stricken way with whatever demented obsession makes him think he can somehow cause this herd of venal pigs to see the light and make him their leader. But after watching McGovern perform in 2 primaries, I think he should stay in the Senate, where his painfully earnest style is not only more appreciated, but far more effective than it is on the nationwide stump. His surprising Neal victory in New Hampshire was less a triumph than a spin-off from Muskie's incredible bungling. But up close, he is a very likable and convincing person, in total contrast to Big Ed, who seems okay on TV, or the other end of a crowded auditorium, but who almost turns off everybody in the misfortune of having to deal with him personally. Another key factor in New Hampshire was that George McGovern only needed 30,007 votes to achieve the psychological upset that came with his 37% figure versus Muskie's 46%. This was possible because McGovern was able, in New Hampshire, to campaign in the low-key town meeting person-to-person style in which he's most effective, but which will physically be impossible in big, delegate-heavy states like California, Pennsylvania, Illinois, or even Wisconsin. Chicago alone will send 80 delegates to the Democratic Convention, compared to only 20 for the whole state of New Hampshire. And in Florida, McGovern managed to reach more than 75,000 voters, but ended up in 6th place with a depressing 6% of the state's total. The New Hampshire primary is perhaps the only important national election where a candidate like McGovern can be truly effective. Crowds seem to turn him off instead of on. He lacks that sense of drama, that instinct for timing and orchestration that is the real secret of success in American politics. Frank Mankiewicz seems to have it, and that helps, but probably not enough. In a political situation where it's almost mathematically impossible to win anything unless you can make the sap rise in a crowd, a presidential candidate like McGovern, who simply lacks the chemistry, is at a fatal disadvantage in a mass vote sense. Scenes where a ho-ho verbal counterpunch at the right time can be worth 4 dozen carefully reasoned position papers. The main problem in any democracy is that crowd pleasers are generally brainless swine who go out on a stage and whip up their supporters into an orgiastic frenzy. then go back to the office and sell every one of the poor bastards down the tube for a nickel apiece. Probably the rarest form of life in American politics is the man who could turn on a crowd and still keep his head straight, assuming it was a problem in the first place, which harks back to McGovern's problem. He's probably the most honest, big-time politician in America. Robert Kennedy, several years earlier, was murdered, called George McGovern the most decent man in the Senate, which is not quite the same thing as being the best candidate for President of the United States. For that, McGovern would at least need one dark, kinky streak of Mick Jagger in his soul. Not much, and perhaps not even enough so people would notice at lunch in the Capitol Hill Hotel or walking down the hallway of the Senate office building, but just enough to drift out on the stage in front of a big crowd and let the spectacle turn him on. That may be the handle. Maybe the whole secret of turning a crowd on is getting turned on yourself by the crowd. The only candidate running for the presidency today who seems to understand this is George Wallace, which might be at least partially why Bobby Kennedy was the only candidate who could take votes away from Wallace in '68. Kennedy, like Wallace, was able to connect with people on some kind of visceral, instinctive level that is probably both above and below rational politics. McGovern does not appear to have this instinct. He does not project real well, and his sense of humor is so dry that a lot of people insist on calling it withered. Maybe so. That may be the root reason of why I can't feel entirely comfortable around George. But he would probably not agree with my conviction that a sense of humor is the main measure of sanity. But who can say for sure? Humor is a very private thing. One night, about 5 years ago in Idaho, Mike Solheim and I were sitting in his house talking about Lenny Bruce in a fairly serious vein, when he suddenly got up and put a record on that I still remember as one of the most hysterical classics of satire I'd ever heard in my life. I laughed for 20 minutes. Every line was perfect. "What's the name of this album?" I said. "I thought I'd heard it all before this stuff, but this one is incredible." "You're right," he said. "It's not Lenny Bruce." "Bullshit," I said. "Let me see the jacket." He smiled and tossed it across the room to me. It was General Douglas MacArthur's famous farewell speech to Congress in '52. Remember that one? The old "Soldiers Never Die" number? My friend Raoul Duke calls it one of the 10 best mescaline records ever cut. I'm a little sick of that episode. Solheim and I are still friends, but not in the same way. That record is not for everybody. I wouldn't recommend it to a general audience, but then I wouldn't recommend it to George McGovern either. Jesus, the only small point I meant to make when I jackknifed into this trip was that McGovern is unusual for a politician, and that he is less impressive on TV than he is in person. One of Muskie's main problems thus far has been that not even his own hired staff people liked him. The older ones try to explain this problem away by saying, "Ed's under a lot of pressure these days, but he's a really fine guy underneath." The younger staff members have apparently never had that much contact with the real Muskie. Very few exceptions, they justify their strained allegiance to the man by saying, "I wouldn't be working for him except that he's the only Democrat that can beat Nixon." Or at least that's what they said before the polls closed in Florida. After that, when it quickly became apparent that Muskie couldn't even beat Scoop Jackson, much less Hubert Humphrey or George Wallace, he was faced with the virtual election night mutiny among the younger staff people, and even the veterans were so alarmed that they convened an emergency conference in Muskie headquarters at Miami's DuPont Plaza Hotel and decided the candidate would have to drastically change his image. For months they'd been trying to sell the man from Maine as a comfortable, mush-mouthed, middle-of-the-road compromiser who wouldn't dream of offending anybody. A real centrist candidate who would be all things to all men. But the voters were not quite that stupid. Muskie had bombed in New Hampshire on what even the candidate admitted was his own turf, and then came down to Florida and got stomped so badly that his campaign staffers were weeping uncontrollably in front of TV cameras in the ballroom that had been advertised all day on the DuPont Plaza billboard as the scene of Muskie's victory party. I got there just after he'd come down from his upstairs hideaway to console the crowd and denounce George Wallace on network TV as a demagogue of the worst sort, and a threat to the country's underlying values of humanism, of decency, of progress. This outburst was immediately interpreted by local politicians as a slur on the people of Florida, calling 42% of the electorate dupes and racist pigs because they voted for George Wallace. U.S. Senator Ed Gurney of Florida demanded an apology, but Muskie ignored him and went back upstairs to the smoke-filled room where his wizards had already decided that his only hope was to fast turn to the left. No more of that centrist bullshit. They looked both ways, and seeing the right was very crowded, convinced each other that Muskie's new image would be the liberal alternative to Hubert Humphrey. And besides, neither McGovern nor Lindsay were showing much of strength out there in left field, so Big Ed would probably fare a hell of a lot better by picking a fight with those two than he would by moving right and tangling with Humphrey and Jackson. Robert Squire, Muskie's national media advisor, emerged from the meeting and said, "We're going to erase that yellow stripe in the middle of the road." Another one of the brain trusters tried to put a better face on it. "The irony of this defeat," he said, "is that it will make Muskie what we all wanted him to be all along. The only question is whether it's too late." In the final analysis, as it were, this painful think session was summed up for the New York Times by a nameless key aide advisor who explained the reason people didn't vote for Ed Muskie here is that they didn't have any reason to. Zang! The candidate's reaction to this ultimate nut of wisdom was not recorded, but we can only assume he was pleased to see signs that at least one of his ranking advisors was finally beginning to function well enough on the basic motor skill, signal recognition level that he might soon learn to tie his own shoes. If I were running for the presidency of the United States and I had heard a thing like that from somebody I was paying $1,000 a week, I would have the bastard drop down an elevator shaft. But Muskie has apparently grown accustomed to this kind of waterhead talk from his staff. They're not an impressive group on the evidence. One of the first things you'll notice around any Muskie headquarters, local or national, is that many of the people in charge are extremely fat. Not just chubby or paunchy or flabby, but serious glandular cases. They require assistance getting in and out of cars or even elevators. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't mention this kind of thing. For all the obvious reasons, general humanity, good taste, relevance, etc. But in the context of what has happened to Ed Muskie in the first place, these two primaries, it's hard to avoid the idea that there may be some ominous connection between the total failure of his campaign and the people who are running it. As late as February 15th, Ed Muskie was generally conceded, even by his political opponents, to be within an eyelash or two of winning the Democratic nomination so skillfully locked up that the primaries wouldn't even be necessary. He had the public endorsements of almost every big name in the party, including some who said they were only backing him because he was so far ahead that nobody else had a chance. Which was just as well, they said, because it was very important to get the party machinery into high gear early on behind a consensus candidate. And Ed Muskie, they all agreed, was the only Democrat who could beat Nixon in November. The word went out early, long before Christmas, and by January it had already filtered down to the low-level fringe groups like the National Association of Student Governments and other youth vote organizers, who were suddenly faced with the choice of either getting your people behind Muskie or crippling the party with another one of those goddamn protest movements that'll end like all the others and not accomplish shit except to guarantee Nixon's re-election. A lot of people bought this, particularly the youth leader types, who saw themselves playing key roles in high-powered, issue-oriented Muskie campaign that would not only dump Nixon, but put a certified good guy in the White House. In retrospect, the Sunshine Special sounds more like an ill-conceived disaster than it did at the time. When Rubin and the Boohoo made such a shambles of Muskie's arrival in Miami that the local news media devoted almost as much time and space to the senator's clash with anti-war hecklers at the train station as it did with the whole 400-mile, 36-hour whistle-stop tour that covered the length of the state, produced what the candidates' headquarters said were 5 major statements in 5 cities. It probably cost the Muskie campaign $40,000, almost $7,500 of that for the rental of the 5-car train from Amtrak. Staff salaries and special expenses for the trip, 30 advance men spending 2 weeks in each town along the route to make sure Big Ed would draw crowds for the TV cameras, payment to musicians, Rosie Greer, etc. A list of all expenses would probably drive the cost of the spectacle up closer to $50,000. For all this money, time, and effort, Muskie's combined whistle-stop crowds totaled less than 3,000, including the disastrous climax that only botched news coverage in Miami, the state, and the whole country, but also came close to shattering the senator's nerves. In addition to all that, his major statements along the way were contemptuously dismissed as oatmeal by most of the press and network TV news editors in New York and Washington. In a word, the Sunshine Special bombed. The Miami Herald reported in the same article, dominated by the Reuben Boohoo incident, that Muskie's trip into the politics of the past was considered a failure even by the senator's own staff. Meanwhile, in that same issue of the Herald, right next to the ugly saga of the Sunshine Special, was a photograph of grinning George Wallace chatting with national champion stock car racer Richard Petty at the Daytona 500, where 98,600 fans were treated to a few informal remarks by the governor, who said he'd only come to watch the races and check up on his old friend Dick Petty, who enjoys the same kind of superhero status in the South that Jean-Claude Killy has in ski country. That appearance at the Daytona 500 didn't cost Wallace a dime, and the AP wire photo of him and Petty that went to every daily and Sunday newspaper in Florida was worth more to Wallace than his own weight in pure gold. And there was also the weight of the 98,600 racing fans who figure that any friend of Richard Petty's must sit on both shoulders of God in his spare time. The Florida primary is over now. George Wallace stomped everybody. With 42% of the vote in field of 11, Ed Muskie, the erstwhile national frontrunner, finished a sick fourth with only 9%, and then he went on all the TV networks to snarl about how this horrible thing would never have happened except that Wallace is a beast and a bigot. Which is at least half true, but it doesn't have to do much with why Muskie got beaten, like a gong in Florida. The real reason is that the man from Maine, who got the nod many months ago as the choice of the Democratic Party's ruling establishment, is running one of the stupidest and most incompetent political campaigns since the Tom Dewey took his dive and elected Truman in 1948. If I had any vested interest in the Democratic Party, I would do everything possible to have Muskie committed at once. Another disaster at the polls might put him around the bend, and unless all the other Democratic candidates are killed in a stone blizzard between now and April 4th, Muskie is going to absorb another serious beating in Wisconsin. I'm probably not the only person who has already decided to be almost anywhere except in Big Ed's Milwaukee headquarters when the polls close on election night. The place will probably be dead empty and all the windows taped. TV crews hunkered down behind overturned ping-pong tables, hoping to film the ex-front-runner from a safe distance when he comes crashing into the place to blame his sixth-place finish on some kind of holy alliance between Tigrace Atkinson and Judge Crater. Nor is there any reason to believe he will refrain from physical violence at that time. With his dream and nerves completely shot, he might start laying hands on people. Hopefully, some of his friends will be there to restrain the wiggly bastard. All we can be sure of, however, is the list of those who will not be there under any pretense at all. Senator Harold Hughes will not be there, for instance, and neither will Senator John Tunney, nor will any of the other senators, governors, mayors, congressmen, labor leaders, liberal pundits, fascist lawyers, fixers from ITT, and extremely powerful Democratic National Committee women who are already on the record as full-bore committed to stand behind Big Ed. None of these people will be there when Ed Muskie sees the first returns from Wisconsin and feels the rush of pus into his brain. At that moment, he will have to depend on his friends because his suitcase full of endorsements he's been dragging around won't be worth the price of checking it into a local bus station locker. except perhaps for Birch Bay. There is something that doesn't quite meet the eye when connected with this one. It makes no sense at all on its face. Why would one of Ted Kennedy's closest friends and allies in the Senate suddenly jump on the Muskie bandwagon when everybody else is struggling to get off gracefully? Maybe Birch is just basically a nice guy, one of those down-home, warm-hearted Hoosiers you hear so much about. Maybe he and Big Ed are lifelong buddies, but if that were so, you'd think Bay might have offered to fix Muskie up with some high-life political talent back then, when it would have made a difference. But times are tricky now, and you never know when even one of your best friends might slap a ruinous lawsuit on you for some twisted reason that nobody understands. Almost everybody you meet these days is nervous about the nasty drift of things. It is becoming increasingly possible, for instance, that Hubert Humphrey will be the Democratic presidential nominee this year, which would cause another Nixon-Humphrey campaign, and a thing like that could probably have a serious effect on my nerves. I prefer no election at all to another Humphrey nightmare. 6 months ago it seemed out of the question, but no longer. Frank Mankiewicz was right. For months he'd been telling anybody who'd asked him that the Democratic race would boil down, after the first few primaries, to a Humphrey-McGovern battle. But nobody took him seriously. We all assumed he was talking up Humphrey's chances in order to slow Muskie down and keep McGovern very viable. But apparently he was serious all along. Humphrey is in the bookie's choice in Wisconsin, which would finish Muskie and make Hubert the high rider all the way to Oregon and Colorado primaries in early June. The other race is between McGovern and Lindsay, which might strike a lot more sparks than it has so far if anybody really believed the boneheads who run the Democratic Party would conceivably nominate either one of them. There is one definite possibility that the Democratic Convention this year might erupt into something beyond the control of anybody, and the new delegate selection rules make it virtually impossible for old-style bosses like Mayor Daley to treat delegates like sheep hauled in to be dipped. A candidate like Lindsay or McGovern might be able to raise serious hell in deadlock convention, but the odds are better than even that Hubert will peddle his ass to almost anybody who wants a chunk of it, and then arrive in Miami with the nomination sewed up and Nixon waiting to pounce on him the instant he comes off his scumbag. Another Nixon-Humphrey horror would be almost certainly cause a fourth party uprising and guarantee Nixon's re-election, which might bring the hounds of hell down on the people for the next 4 long years. But personally, I think I'd be inclined to take that risk. Hubert Humphrey is a treacherous, gutless old war healer who should be put up in a goddamn bottle and set out with the Japanese current. The idea of Humphrey running for president again makes a mockery out of things that would take me too long to explain or even list here. And Hubert Humphrey wouldn't understand what I was talking about anyway. He was a swine in '68, and he's worse now. If the Democratic Party nominates Humphrey again in '72, the party will get exactly what it deserves.